Hi, I'm Abdul Saad, clinical psychologist at Vital Mind Psychology here in Sydney, Australia, and I come to you today with the new video in the series on self-transformation. In the last video last week, I discussed the concept of liminal space and liminality as a process of entering into a state of disorientation once our typical patterns, maps, ways of being in the world are no longer functioning and are no longer appropriately calibrated toward reality. And what I want to do today is look at what is beyond liminal space. And one of the key concepts to understand at this point, if you've been following this series from the part one, which is what is self-transformation, is that fundamentally we can grow in two ways. We can grow through suffering, and that is very hard-won, hard-earned knowledge and insight and growth. But once we've crossed that suffering threshold, something begins to happen which is incredibly powerful, and that is we can grow through insight. And for many people, it takes an event or multiple events where they suffer, where there's a breakdown of their patterns and their way of being in the world before they need to start confronting things in their life and in their histories and in the patterns that they've been running. And from that point, they can begin growing through the development of new insight. So to sort of underscore that, if we begin growing through insight, we no longer need to suffer as much, or we have a different relationship with suffering. And that's what I want to look at today. So once we begin to cross this threshold of suffering, entering into liminal space, what is beyond that? Well, what's beyond that is a process. And what I want to do in the remaining 3 videos is break that process down into 3 parts. The first part is we need to turn inward. Being in liminal space and experiencing suffering that feels intolerable and that triggers our core fears is disorientating, and in that process of disorientation, we want to begin to turn inward as step 1 to build authenticity, to build radical self-honesty, because otherwise what we can do is we can start to look outward to the world and how we have been wronged by the world and begin to feel victimized, rather than balancing that with also turning inward and developing authenticity. So step 1, beyond being in a liminal space, is build authenticity by turning inward, developing radical self-honesty. Related to that, in step 2 is to confront our shadow, which I'll be talking about in the next video. And then the third stage or step is to develop an integrated self, and I'll be talking about in the video after next. So briefly for today, turning inward, what does that mean? Well, to turn inward and to build authenticity means that we are willing to confront those aspects of our sense of self and those adaptations which up until this point have been largely unconscious. We begin to confront what are the ways that we have fallen asleep to ourselves. And in order to guide you through this, and there's many paths toward this is something that human beings have been doing well before modern psychology was on the scene. This is part of the human experience. But what I want to do is give you in this video a simple model of what are the sorts of things you might want to start looking for, or what are the questions or areas you want to examine as guides in order to build authenticity and engage in radical self-honesty to begin to get you out of the liminal space and cross that threshold where you begin to grow through development of insight rather than needing to grow through suffering. So the model I want to share is, think of a triangle. And I've talked about this in some part in a previous video on the 3 types of intelligence. This comes from a system that I use as part of my coaching, and that it has really influenced my thinking about human development. It's called the Enneagram, ENNEAGRAM. And the Enneagram is a really powerful model because it can assist us in the self-transformation process, because it gives us a nice guide to 3 core areas of wounding which are part of the human experience according to 3 centers of intelligence. So here are the 3 areas that you might want to start looking at. The first one has to do with the core emotion of shame. And shame is the underlying feeling of a lack of worth, a lack of significance, that I am defective, I am unmasked, I am exposed. And by beginning to examine the role of shame in your life, you want to start to look for, well, how have I adapted to the shame that I've experienced? And shame is a universal emotion, no one escapes it. So in other words, what is the image, what is the persona, what is the image that I have presented to the world and to myself that has shielded me from shame? Has it been the image of I'm a winner, I'm an achiever? Has it been the image of I am this helpful person and I'm self-sacrificing? Has it been the image that I am mysterious and misunderstood and flawed in some way? And has that been the way that I have compensated for a feeling of shame, by becoming attached to a particular image of myself? And if this is a core issue for you, if you recognize that you have an issue with shame and image management and how you present yourself to the world, and are sensitive to how people perceive you, then this is one area you want to engage in radical self-honesty in, as you explore, how have I fallen asleep to my true self and substituted that for a particular image that I project onto the world and that I want the world to see me as. So shame is a key issue that we want to look at, and what patterns have we developed to basically deal with our shame so it's not so powerful and destructive in our life. But paradoxically, that very pattern or image actually creates more and more shame for us, because it keeps us away from who we truly are, and it makes our relationships less and less authentic as people begin to perceive us for the image we are and not for who we truly are. So the first part of the model is to look at shame and to look at how we have compensated for our shame by developing a particular image. And this is going to be really important for people who are what we call heart types, or who are in the heart center, if you want to start to examine the Enneagram as a model for self-transformation. And if you need help with that, that's actually my expertise, in helping people with models like the Enneagram to better understand themselves. The second domain that we want to look at as we're engaging in radical self-honesty has to do with the emotion of fear. And in this domain, we're asking the question, how has fear influenced the way that I am in the world? How have I navigated my fear of chaos and uncertainty? What are the mental machinations that I have engaged in that have kept my anxiety at bay? How have I disassociated from my sense of internal authority? Have I done it by becoming withdrawn and overly focused on mental ideas and concepts? Have I done it by becoming overly security conscious and hyper-focused on loyalty? Have I done it by becoming more hedonistic and focused on pleasure and keeping things light and actually becoming really cut off from my anxiety? So this is the second way, this is the second core emotion. So we have shame and we have fear. And what we want to do is to start to examine how have those emotions created certain patterns in our life which defend us against feeling those emotions at their deepest level. And the third emotional area we want to look at as we're building authenticity and beginning to turn inward is that of anger or rage. How has anger or rage manifested in my life, or how have I blocked myself from feeling my anger and rage, repressed what I know to be true? How have I over-controlled my anger so that I feel like I'm not really in touch with it or aware of it? Or how have I over-relied upon my anger in order to feel like I can't be vulnerable in the world and I need to push against reality? So in a nutshell, when we begin to turn inward, we need a model or a map which can guide us. And think of what I'm presenting today as a simple model of the triangle, where you start to examine, okay, with the suffering that I've gone through, with the upheavals, with the breakdown of my patternings and the way that I typically am in the world, with the confusion and disorientation, how can I begin to examine that by turning inward and asking myself the key questions and taking an internal inventory of how have I adapted to and how have I defended against these three core emotions which are ubiquitous within the human experience. The emotion of shame, which is linked to a lack of self-worth. What is the image I've created in order to guard against that? And for example, if you find that there's a key issue there, it may be, for example, that you've suffered where your image has broken down of being high achieving, of being competent, or of being helpful. Perhaps you've entered into a relationship which has really been non-reciprocal, which has burnt you as an empath. And then you're going to have to really re-examine, what is the image of myself that I have become so attached to that was not reciprocated, was not seen, or was not appreciated in this relationship? And do I now have to go back and understand the origins of this particular image or manifestation of myself that I've become so closely wedded to throughout my life that I've confused it for who I truly am, for my true essence? If you turn inward and find that fear has actually been a large factor in the creation of your suffering, that you've been ruled by the mind and the fear of chaos and the need to defend against uncertainty, then also you will begin to confront, well, what are the patterns? What are the ways that I've defended myself against fear, and how can I understand the breakdown of that pattern at this point in my life so that I'm actually feeling very fearful, that I need to turn inward and look at how I've tried to manage my fear in a way that is just not working. And if anger or rage is a core issue, rage at unmet needs, rage at not having the space to exist in the world, of the world putting all these barriers in front of me that I need to keep pushing against, then also what we need to do is identify, well, what is the pattern, or what is the map that I've developed? What's the ego structure that's crystallized that has led me to reach a point where I'm actually mired and drowning in anger and in rage at my unmet needs, where my pattern has broken down? So this is the first step. We need to turn inward. We need to build authenticity. And as a guide, think of taking an inventory of how these three core emotions have influenced your life. Now, if we have a major catastrophic event in our life which forces us to enter into liminal space, into this state of disorientation, it will usually trigger all three fears, or all three centers. We're going to feel shame, we are going to feel fear, and we're going to feel rage. And that combination will force people into some sort of therapy or some sort of inner work to help them understand why they're in such a state of turmoil. Now, there are other paths that you can take for turning inward. Today has just been about presenting a simple model. And next week I'll be talking more about understanding or confronting our shadow, which is the collective positive and negative aspects that we've repressed about ourselves deep into our unconscious, as a second step. And it's related to this first step of turning inward as the second step toward growth. And then we will talk about what it means to develop an integrated sense of self, where we become much more aware of the patterns we tend to go into. We become much more aware of our adaptations and our shadow, and what that actually looks like when someone begins to develop a more integrated sense of self. So I look forward to catching you for the video next week as we rapidly progress toward the end of the year. Thank you for all your support this year. I really appreciated all the great feedback, and I look forward to catching you soon, God willing. Take care. Bye-bye.